Augusta. Written by Celia Ryker. Narrated by Maria Mccann. To Grandma Dawson. She lived in a cottage on the lake, taught me to appreciate a walk in the woods, and not to be afraid of loon calls or snakes. Her life seemed wonderfully simple. I didn't know then that Grandma's name was Augusta. Prologue. The round toes of her sensible shoes were barely visible among the fallen leaves. The sidewalk beneath autumn's litter was smooth and level, but her pace slowed as she neared the backyard on the corner. Her thin gray coat ruffled in a gust of wind, its mismatched buttons barely holding it in place. Will she be outside? Will I get to see her face? If she's indoors, I'll just walk on by like so many other times. Thoughts whirled through Augusta's mind as she neared her destination. She was glad the sidewalks were empty. It was no secret she used to have 4 children and now had only 3, but people who knew her story never spoke of it. She was ashamed of what she'd done, but as a farmer's daughter, she'd learned early on about the harshness of life. It hadn't felt like she had a choice, even as she made it. A waitress raising 4 children on her own in 1920s Detroit was but one of many sad stories. A regular customer had heard of Augusta's situation, and they had become friends, or at least friendly. Over the course of many meals, they got to know one another, though they never sat down together. They chatted as Augusta brought sandwiches and soup, and Judith always left a healthy tip. Augusta told family and friends when Otis left. She'd thought her husband might have gone back to Alton, Illinois. He'd talked about that town like it was a slice of heaven and had chosen Alton for his son's middle name. Augusta contacted people in Illinois she'd heard Otis mention, but they denied knowing where he was. She was afraid her children would end up in an orphanage, all of them. She'd had to work to feed them all, which left them home alone. The 2 older girls, Yvonne and Thelma, 12 and 13 years old, looked after their little brother Buddy and the baby. Sometimes, exhausted at the end of a workday, Augusta watched her daughters deftly changing diapers and wished their lives were easier. She could provide care or she could provide food, but it seemed impossible to provide both. Lottie was an infant when her father walked out of their lives, young enough to perhaps be unharmed by an adoption. It wasn't clear to Augusta exactly how she'd let it happen. Judith and her husband had always wanted children, but after many years they'd given up trying. They promised to love and care for Charlotte. They could give her a good life and would provide money for Augusta to care for her family, what was left of it. Augusta strained to remember how the question had been asked. We were friends. No, we were never friends. We exchanged friendly words. I said too much and heard more than I should, feeling sympathy for someone who had so much more than I'd ever have. Sympathy sailed both ways in those conversations, and now, since the adoption, we rarely speak. She shuffled through the leaves, hoping to see her little girl in someone else's backyard. There she is. She's wearing a white pinafore I could never afford. She looks happy and healthy, but what could I do if she wasn't? I couldn't pick her up and take her home. And what if I did? What if I reached over that fence and hugged my sweet Lottie to my chest and ran away with her? I can't do that. I can only glance over as I walk by, like any stranger on any sidewalk, and hope to hear her laugh. The little girl in the perfect pinafore jumped up from her toys and toddled toward the sidewalk.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?